All right, so with us is the former Chief Censor, David Shanks. Only been out of the job for a few months, David, like May-ish, is that right?
That's right, May. Yep.
Is it good to be out? Like, is it just another chapter, or is there some things that you're like, oh, sheesh, that's behind me?
Look, it's another chapter. It's just different. I wouldn't say it's in some ways it's good to move on. In some ways, I very much miss the dynamism and some of the significance of the work that I was involved with as Chief Censor. But yes, another chapter. So it's all good and it's going well.
I always think about the Chief Censor's job, and when we talked last time, because for those who don't know, you've done a podcast with me 18 months or so ago with a writers' festival, and I always think the idea of kind of watching movies for a living sounds so romantic, but obviously you guys don't just watch movies, you get down into the deep and grimy parts of this world, so it must be quite taxing as well.
Yeah, look, that's right. There was undeniably some fun and even entertaining aspects of the job. I remember when I started up back in, we're going back to May 2017. Early on, I realised that I would be having the opportunity to classify a whole bunch of international film festival films, including a bunch of things that I normally would just look at in the festival program and go, oh, I'd love to see that, but I'll never get time. And I was able to do it as part of my official duties, which was great. But as you say, there's definitely another aspect to the role.
Yeah, and look, sadly, it was lovely to catch up with you when we caught up with you face to face. Sadly, this is a bit of a not a negative catch up between you and I, but we are talking about one of those grimy areas in society at the moment. I don't want to actually underplay it by using that word. It's far more horrific than grimy. You know what I'm saying? But I wanted to kind of clear up some things, acknowledging that, you know, leaving a role, especially in a government kind of appointed role, there's probably things that it's not appropriate for you to comment on or things you can't comment on. So I'm fully expecting if I've asked any of these questions, you might just go, I can't answer that right now. And that's fully fine. But we're going to come to you and try and get you to clear up some things for us about objectionable material. Now, we are specifically talking about the Christchurch Mosque Massacre. And I guess maybe you could just tell us to start off with the story behind, story is the wrong word, the process behind that becoming an objectionable officially. Because I was reading something out of a paper, actually no, it was DIA, Department of Internal Affairs, on the 15th of March that said this may be deemed an objectionable piece of material. So it hadn't been officially called that yet, but the government was already signaling that. So what was the process from going from obviously all of us thinking this is the most disgusting thing we've ever seen, those people who could see it, to this is likely going to be objectionable, to this is officially objectionable? How does that work?
Yeah, look, I guess there's a difference between how things work normally and how things worked in that particular case and how things increasingly need to operate now. Because, essentially how things are architected to work, how the system operates, how it was originally and traditionally conceived was that you had a category of material that was unlawful, objectionable, that's defined broadly in a framework in the Classification Act that I operated to and my team operated to in the Classification Office. Mm-hmm. And essentially it was mostly up to enforcement authorities to detect, find this material, find that on potentially an offender's computer or detect it coming into the country through customs and the like, and for enforcement authorities to form a view as to whether something may be objectionable and to take enforcement action at that point. And then, if necessary, refer it to the Chief Censor and the Classification Office for an official determination confirming that assessment as to its status as to whether
just on that point, it made me think, can a government or our government, because you went with our government, could a government deem something objectionable, deem something illegal without the chief censor? Or does the chief censor have to be involved for then the government to be able to enact a law around it?
So that's an interesting and fine but important point in these areas, because effectively a government cannot deem something objectionable without some kind of distance and independence around that determination. And that's really what the chief censor is for under our system, because if you have a government stepping in, making calls about what is and is not lawful, then you're very much on a slippery, you're rapidly on a slippery slope that ends in absurd situations like you have in Russia right now, where journalists are going to jail for calling what is happening in Ukraine a war. Instead of a special military operation or whatever the official, So whenever you give a government the capacity to make that determination off its own compass or concerns and considerations, you're immediately into a very difficult phase, which is why the chief censor isn't independent and the classification office is an independent Crown entity.
Well, however, what I hear you saying is, if a government can ban things outright, that's a risk of that government becoming tyrannical. So actually, the chief censor is the yardstick between that, because then you could get that example where the government says, actually, that satirical stuff about our party, that's illegal. So that's So I mean, not the example you're talking about, but they could then say anything. Any government in power could say, you're saying nasty words about me, that's illegal.
I think history gives us some cues that once you have the power taking on that authority on its own without any level of independence or safeguard around that process, you're on a slippery slope, and it's very, very, very difficult situation. So that's why constitutionally, really, we have that independence. However, that is not to say that the police or DIA or customs as enforcement authorities cannot make a enforcement decision. This is objectionable. We are going to prosecute and charge you. And there is no specific requirement under the legislation for them to refer that determination to the classification office. Normally they will in situations where there's any doubt, and it's probably worth mentioning that the vast majority of actual prosecutions traditionally in this area for objectionable publications have related to child sexual abuse material and that sort of category, where enforcement authorities are quite clear about where the demarcations and boundaries are.
Yeah. So we're in the middle of October. This horrific event has happened. What is the process then where you went through as the chief censor then to officially make this objectionable?
So, I mean, March 15 was an extraordinary event in that context, right? Because this wasn't a situation where enforcement authorities had located, found something on an offender's system or detected something on the dark web or something of that kind, and are then going through a process and referring it to the chief censor with usually plenty of time through the judicial and prosecutorial process to work that through. March 15 was a situation where this content it went viral. It went everywhere. It went all over the net, all over the world, and was, I understand, auto-playing on some people's social media feeds because it was high engagement material.
Wow.
So effectively, I would say the offender in that situation, the terrorist, was more than likely banking on exactly that happening and was aware that the algorithmic operation around high engagement material would do a large part of what the job he was seeking to do for him and for like-minded terrorists and extremists, and just act on material that was current, that was very high engagement. Anyone who received that video would react to it in some way, and quite often share it, or trigger the algorithm that's telling the automated systems, hey, this stuff is going to get a reaction, so let's boost it. So right away, extraordinary things were happening right across the internet with digital safety teams in Google and Facebook and the like, really fighting a war against their own automated systems to try and pull that content down. And of course, there was also supporters of the terrorist who were coaching each other in real time to tell each other how they could slightly edit or adjust or slow the video to evade the hash algorithm detection kind of firewalls that the safety teams were trying to put up. So, I mean, absolutely extraordinary sequence of events. And in terms of me and my office, I was essentially engaged with talking to organizations across the system to assess what was going on and to work through the best and fastest response that we could. And of course, part of that involved me thinking through, well, how can I get a evidential copy of this to assess it? And how can I work through a process as quickly as possible that is still robust and will be able to withstand an appeal and review? Because the decision to classify that video as objectionable was tested to our board of review. It was contested, as I expected it would be. And I knew that essentially me coming up with a snap judgment over the phone to enforcement authorities with no documentation or background or reasoning around that was not going to withstand those pressures down the track. What we ultimately did was we pulled together a small core team at the classification office on Monday morning, I think it was, having worked through, having received, having called in the video through that process, having effectively an official version of it, reviewed it, and rather than going through the process we normally would, which is forming an opinion, writing it up, testing that out, and delivering that, which would normally take weeks, in the ordinary course of events, we had the meeting, we looked at it, we discussed it, and we file noted there and then our decision, and we started talking about it straight away, and we left the writing up of the judgment, if you like, about that to come. So that allowed us to front, the obvious extreme pressure right across the system to have the determination and have clarity around the status of that video.
I'm interested more of on a personal level. When you said your team got together on Monday morning, I kind of think about you guys seeing from the best stuff in the world to the worst stuff in the world, kind of being sort of hardened to seeing some pretty horrible things, whether it is, sexual or whether it is violence. How did your team react to seeing that? Like, was there a personal reaction at all, or was it just all professional? You were able to do that in that moment?
So, I mean, it's a good question. The honest answer is there was visible emotional reaction from the team. This was a horrific thing. It's impossible to view without having some form of emotional reaction to it. It would be hard to maintain your humanity without that. But I guess from a vantage point, if you were a fly on the wall watching us watch that, you wouldn't notice much,
right?
Because this is our job. This was uniquely horrific in a number of respects, but in other respects, it was in the category of other material that we had already spent quite a bit of time working through. And part of the professionalism that we have is understanding that this material will have an emotional impact. It could have, traumatizing impacts for sure. And we do wrap supports, counselling, and processes around all of our people to ensure that we can manage that.
So let's say we've made that moment where you've made it public. The decision is officially this is now objectionable. What does that mean? Does that mean it's illegal to have it as a file in the country? Does that mean it's illegal to even see it, even if the file is stored in, pick an international country? What does that actually mean for the public at that point?
Yeah, well, what that actually means in the digital era can come down to some quite arcane factors around whether your computer is storing a temporary copy of the file. Essentially, the act that we operate under is a 1993 act. That means functionally it's pre-internet.
VCRs. So you're worried about VCRs in 93?
That's right. Yeah. The act is primarily big chunks of the act is focused on the sorts of physical labels that you can attach to VHS tapes or DVDs that were coming at the time. It doesn't apply. So, but the in simple terms, what does objectionable mean? It means it is prohibited and it is unlawful to have, to possess, and certainly, and there's tiers in there about sharing or publishing it further in terms of the penalties that can apply. Whether you possess something or not, and this has been tested out in the child sexual abuse kind of prosecutions in areas, to some degree. But technology keeps changing all the time, right? So there's constant development in the area. But essentially, if you're accessing objectionable material on your computer, typically you often will be saving it as file, or even your computer will be saving it as file without you necessarily consciously being aware of it. And you can be prosecuted for possession. You have it. You have a digital copy.
What about if you stream objectionable material? Like, people use, I think they're called P2P sharing sites for watching movies and stuff on the internet, and a physical copy never comes into your computer. It streams from that provider. So someone who does have it, it streams into your, I guess, screen, but it doesn't actually get a downloaded copy. How do you address that? Because I think that kind of stuff, not that we're going to talk about the court case per se, but that kind of stuff might be what some of the things are going to be talked about when that does eventually happen. If you don't own a physical copy of it, if you don't have the file in your computer, but you see it and it's based in a server in another country, how does the chief censor approach that for objectionable material?
Well, the bottom line is how the chief censor approaches that is that's a prosecution issue that doesn't really come into the chief censor's consideration. From the chief censor's point of view, you're given a file and you're told to assess. The task is to classify that material. So the question as to whether the offender actually had possession of it and for the purposes of legal prosecution, that's a prosecution matter.
Right. So that gets decided in court, basically, is what you're saying. Whether that means they've got ownership or not, that's for the courts to decide.
Yeah, that's essentially an evidential and prosecutorial elements of the offence is possession, right? Let's, if we're going to have a debate about whether there was actually possession, let's have the debate about that. And these things can get very, very complex, as I'm sure you can imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
Potentially, but I would say in connection with all of that post March 15, there were some amendments to the Classification Act to resolve some potential ambiguities in the law in some of these areas. And one of the amendments did specifically address streaming in terms of making it very clear that the act of streaming objectionable material is an offence.
If you make, so in this case, I think it was a 16-minute video. So if you make a video in its entirety objectionable, does that mean any part of that video is also objectionable? So the way I think about it, and sorry to be I'm not trying to sound flippant, but doing what we do with news, talking about news commentary, we have a right to play clips of copyrighted information as fair use because we're commenting on it. So whilst we may play a clip which is copyrighted, because we're only playing a clip of the whole thing and because we're commenting on it, we're allowed to do that legally. And I'm thinking about this, and I don't know the documentary that this whole thing's been talked about, but if there are clips from the objectionable thing in another item, are those clips still deemed objectionable under the original umbrella?
No, is the short answer. The longer answer is that we spent a bit of time thinking about exactly that point in the immediate aftermath of March 15, because as I've said, this was an extraordinary event.
Yeah.
Unprecedented, really, in terms of the classification process and the urgent need to get clarity out to the public about kind of what the expectations were, what the obligations were on them. And if you look at the Classification Office website to this day, you can still see some of the advice and comment that we provided in this area to the public at the time that we released our decision. And the question that you raise about portions, how does that work? We addressed that and talked about that a bit because we knew that's absolutely going to be part and parcel of the legitimate questions that journalists and all sorts of people would have in the context of this.
Yeah.
The bottom line is that if we classify a video, a live stream or a video, as objectionable, that does not necessarily mean that any still image lifted out or any portion of that video is in its own right objectionable. If you edit an objectionable publication, take out an image or a section, then you've created a new publication under the Act, basically.
Right. Wow.
Which stands to be potentially assessed on its own merit in terms of whether it's objectionable or not. And we dealt with this. We've had multiple occasions since March 15 where this question arose in relation to the use of images or stills and the like. Essentially, what we said in our guidance, and you can go back and have a look on the website in connection with the advice, was that we understood the interests of journalists and commentators and the like to potentially use that sort of material.
Yep.
But we advised that absolute care and professionalism needed to be taken around that. And of course, there's broadcasting standards and journalistic integrity and ethics that apply in a broader sense around all of that, distinct from the legal specific classification. What we did say was that if you were using a section of this live stream that showed people being killed, showed some of the graphic violence in association with the terrorist and white supremacist branding that was promotional throughout the video, then there's every chance that edited section may be objectionable in its own right. So it was impossible to provide absolute bright line specifics around that area, but we tried to provide some practical steers that people could use. And I mean, since then, as one example, a very short segment of the live stream has been used in a Netflix documentary on, I think it's called The Social Dilemma, or documentary about the impacts of social media and some of the downsides in terms of algorithmic amplification in the digital business model. And there's a montage at the start of that documentary of various historic and impactful and some horrific events. And there was a very, very short clip from the start of the live stream included in that documentary. Did not show people being killed, did not show specifically the branding. It was very fleeting. it was an example where looking at that would not fall within the framework of making that new documentary using that section an objectionable, unlawful classification document in its own right.
It sounds like what you're basically saying, for me to dumb it down a bit, is that if you use the most objectionable stuff from the objectionable video, chances are it's still going to be objectionable. But what do you then say? But that's again for the courts to decide. Is that where you sit with that, or do you still have? Does the Chief Censor still have to rule on it?
You know, I mean, there's going to be areas of grey in this space, as there always will be when you're talking about determinations around content. So it may be for the courts, but you know, in terms of making a legal classification assessment that can be then used to prosecute in the courts, that's the Chief Censor's job in the classification office. So, you know, and so we can and did have subsequent variations and edits and GIFs referred through to the office for subsequent review and classification.
I want to ask you a question about the timeline. It's kind of the last question, actually. I had some other ones, but I think we've actually covered them off through our general chit chat here. And that's from the guys from Counterspin Media themselves outside the court on whenever it was, Tuesday of this week. And they made a claim about things being classified retrospectively. I want to play what they've said and then ask you if you've got any clarity on that, if you are indeed even able to answer it, which you may not be, I'm not sure. So they made a claim that they were very careful to say the word allegedly shared some stuff, and that it was retrospectively then made objectionable. So I'll play the bit, and then I want to see if you want to respond to it to clear anything up if you can. So this is what they said outside the courthouse.
Why was material being objectionable, so-called, 2 days after we allegedly posted a link, and then it was signed off on the 25th? So allegedly we posted it on the 22nd.
It's retrospective now, is it?
It was the Chief Censor allegedly deemed it objectionable on the 24th, signed off on the 25th. This is in February, earlier this year. Why did they wait over 6 months?
Until Stuff did their bullshit and bring their fire and fury out, which we destroyed for $10.
You did.
Yeah.
Where they tried to discredit anybody who was standing out and asking questions.
Anyway, that's really the that's not the subject. So they're saying they're claiming that there was a retrospective piece of material that was objectionable, and then they were pulled in after if they allegedly shared it. When they allegedly shared it, it wasn't objectionable. Is there anything you can clear up in there for us to understand?
I think there is. I mean, obviously, I can't comment on the specifics of any matter proceeding through the courts, and I am no longer the Chief Censor, and I'm not aware of actually the specifics of the material that is the subject of
but
the case.
You were chief. This was in February. You were still Chief Censor when this went through. Yeah, just checking.
I was, but the point I'm making is I'm no longer the Chief Censor, and I literally do not know. I have no information about the particulars or the specifics of the material that is the subject of that charge. But I can make a general observation about the process and how the law works in this space. And it's simply this. It is not the case that material that is objectionable is not objectionable until a classification is made.
Right.
So if material is objectionable, it's always objectionable, irrespective of the date of the actual classification. And to illustrate that, to help, I guess, kind of make that understandable, is if someone videos themselves sexually abusing a child and has a recording of that, and shares it with someone or shares it with a network, then it is no defense to those people trading and possessing that material that there doesn't happen to be a classification formally in place around it. it's unlawful.
Yeah.
And the classification process really just confirms its status as unlawful. So it's, yeah, there's simply a process that is easy to miss in terms of kind of how these things work. But if you really think it through practically in terms of how it must work in that context and other contexts, it's not a matter of retrospective application. It's a matter of going, oh yeah, this is unlawful, and now we have a confirmation and classification of that.
So it's basically saying, and these are my words, not yours, that an item has always been illegal, but it's just come out into the light. So we now are making it officially known that it's illegal, but it was still illegal before the actual moment that it came out into the light.
Essentially, yeah. And that's the way it has to operate in this space for the criminal justice system to operate. Because otherwise you'll end up with absolute absurdities, I believe, in terms of the process around classification and prosecution.
Yeah, it means people could commit some horrific acts and crimes, and then once it was deemed objectionable, just stop and go, well, that wasn't objectionable when I did it. So yeah, that makes complete logical. This is why we've got you on, David, just to clear some of these things up. So obviously we're not commenting, which I'm being very careful to use the word allegedly. We know not commenting on the court case, not commenting on what's going on there, but that one fact in and of itself has made things a lot clearer for us to understand what's going on. Now, whether there was criminal activity or not, that's for the courts to decide. But it's been so good, and thank you so much for giving up some of your time this afternoon to help us expand upon that a little bit. And yeah, I hope you're enjoying New Life outside of watching both good and terrible movies and good and terrible content for a living. And thanks heap for joining us this evening.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.